ساعي وامنح الناس حبك بيض الله قلبك بيض الله قلبك كن سموحا لخصمك ألقى خصمك أحبك بيض الله قلبك بيض الله قلبك واحتفل بالمودة إنما
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Sulaimaan Ravat Show. We are coming to you live from our studios here in Sunninghill Hill, Johannesburg this Friday evening. It's an interesting weather pattern that we are experiencing. Yesterday I read in the news they said it would be the coolest day since the beginning of the year, and now we're going into a bit of a cooler, colder weekend with the snow in the bergs. But this day in itself has been a bit up and down. Actually, driving from Lenasia to Sunninghill, there was a patch where it was really raining, very little visibility, and then next minute dry. So a bit of up and down weather. You don't know whether to take out the blankets for the next day or two or not, take out the heavy duty jackets or not. But even if you're feeling cold, we'll keep you warm with some enlightening discussion this evening, inshallah. It is election season, and for the last 2-3 weeks we've been focusing on various aspects pertaining to the upcoming election. It's now it's about a month. And as Muslims, we know on the one hand there's a countdown towards elections, but on the other hand there's a countdown towards Ramadan. And those of us in Muslim media, ITV, the Muslim radio stations, it's double the work preparing for an election broadcast, or being in the process of an election broadcast. It's not only about the days of the election or the few days preceding it and after it. It's about the weeks and the months leading up to it, and the same for the Ramadan broadcast. But it's also an exciting time, and there's a lot to talk about. There's always a lot to talk about here in South Africa. Now we have 3 guests for the program this evening. You may have seen the promos, you may have seen the WhatsApp ads as well, and they're all from ASRI, the Executive Director Mohammed Kaji, the Head of Research Angelo Fick, and the Head of Programs Ibrahim Fakir. Ibrahim will join us a little later in the program, inshallah. But to get things going, we have in studio Mohammed Kaji and Angelo Fick. Mohammed, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And Angelo, assalamu alaikum. Welcome back.
Wa alaikum salam.
All right, before we talk about what we are due to talk about this evening, and that is the manifestos of the 3 major parties in South Africa, what's your thoughts thus far, Mohammed, on how the campaigning is going from the political parties, media coverage? I heard someone say during the course of this week, one of the analysts, I think it was Ralph Mateja, was saying that there are a significant percentage of South Africans who feel what is going to change. The ANC is going to win. It's just a matter of what margin. The DA will either drop a bit or pick up a bit. The EFF will increase its votes, but it's still going to be in position 3. So nothing is going to drastically change in the political landscape in South Africa nationally. Perhaps provincially, 1-2 provinces, it may be tight and there may be coalitions. Well, what kind of vibe are you picking up on, in short?
Look, I think there's a level of fatigue as well in terms of political stories and so on. And there have also been distractions. Remember, earlier in March, we had the 2 weeks of load shedding, which was really the focus of attention in the middle of an election cycle. So I think that's sort of disjointed the campaigns and sort of what the focus of the media has been. I think it's going to pick up now in April, leading into May, because there's only a few weeks left. So I think that momentum around the campaign and so on. But going back to my first point, I think there's a level of fatigue in terms of the public. Part of that could be a sort of disenfranchisement around politics and elections, a sense of disappointment with political parties going into this election, but also, all of the, ongoing scandals and the repetitiveness of disappointments over the Zuma term, and then with the post-Zuma legacy that was left for Ramaphosa to sort of come in and try to start cleaning up and addressing. So I think all of those factors are playing into the current sort of sentiment in the public at this point.
Your thoughts on the same question, Angelo?
I agree with Mohammed that there is fatigue, but I think we also need to separate ordinary South Africans who are not members of political parties, who are the majority of people in this country, and the party loyal. So I think for the party loyal, there is something at stake, they're really invested, they're going to the rallies, they're participating, they're getting involved, and there are, a certain number of people who get swept up with that and into these party activities. For the majority of South Africans, even those who are registered to vote, even those who are voting, this is spectacle that's playing itself out. Come May the 8th, they will cast their ballot for whoever it is they support. But much of this actually isn't taking over the everyday struggles that they have. That includes the economic troubles that they find themselves in, rising cost of living, issues with crime, the very issues that political parties are raising as part of their electoral promises, part of their manifestos, are the substance of people's everyday lives. So, when the president takes a train, millions of people go, well, that's my everyday experience. When somebody goes to a space to talk about, the lack of jobs, millions of people are going, that's my son, that's my daughter you're talking about, that's me. This is what we deal with every day. This is not for us an election issue. This is for us a life and survival issue. Rising petrol prices, rising transport costs, all of those things are there. They're not for people election-related issues, they're life-related issues. And so for parties, they may be part of their election process. For 58 million people, it's everyday life that they have to continue to deal with until and after and through May the 8th.
The three parties that we're going to be discussing in terms of manifestos, just your brief thoughts on their campaigns so far.
I think in general it's as expected, that it's at this point in time it's rallies, door-to-door campaigns, trying to cover the country, getting their posters up in the different cities and the different areas of their constituencies. And I know we're focusing on those three, but I had a surprise this week because I saw Irvin Jum's photo on a poster, So there are some surprises there, but I think in general it's been as expected, that they're really going to be doing their weekend rallies, and they're going to be leading up to a crescendo, which is at the end of the month, being Freedom Day and then Workers' Day. And I think that's really where everything's meant to be gearing up to, which is a week before the election. And there's obviously themes that are coming out in terms of where their focus areas are in terms of these campaigns. Cyril's been crisscrossing the country. He's been incredibly busy. There's the questions around Gauteng. Would the ANC retain Gauteng, and how much work has been put into the province in terms of the campaigning? And then there's the questions around KwaZulu-Natal. I think the point around the ANC is obviously the ongoing internal factionalism within the ANC and the sort of impact that that's having on that campaign. And the EFF, as a party, a similar campaign strategy to the ANC, which is the door-to-door campaigns as well as the rallies, which are sort of a show of force that they're able to mobilize and launch their manifestos in different provinces. So really, I think not anything major out of the ordinary compared to other elections.
I suppose, Angelo, when the strategists within the parties are planning for their campaign and for what they're going to do during that pre-election period, you can only plan in terms of what you can do, but there's only that much you can plan in terms of potential scandals that can come to the fore. Is this where it's getting a bit messy for the ANC? ESCOM impacts on them more than any of the other parties every time there's load shedding. And now all this revelations, I don't know if you can even call it revelations, because many would say we kind of knew this. You're confirming what we already knew in as far as Ace Magashule is concerned.
So I think what we have is a lot of information about the African National Congress because they're the party of government. And so their record in government is what they are having to use to appeal to people. But some of the negative stuff in their record on government is what's being used against them. That doesn't go well, or it is made worse by the internal issues inside the ANC that's playing itself out in public and has been playing itself out in public in, let's say, the last 3 years of Jacob Zuma's administration, and certainly since the 2017 elective conference. But the other two big parties are not absented from this either. So the Democratic Alliance has a record of governance in the Western Cape and in the city of Cape Town. Its record of governance in two other cities, metropoles, is a matter of sketchy debate and of internal division. But the Democratic Alliance had their head of policy quit earlier in the year. And so that spoke to the divisions, which people continue to talk about, between old actors in the party and the kind of renewal that somebody like Musi Maimane was supposed to bring. And so there are old-style liberals and there are new-style social democrats who have some kind of policy and other kinds of conflicts. In the economic freedom fighters, similar kinds of divisions seem to be brewing into and bubbling to the top of the public agenda around issues around the VBS. So the three major parties have internal struggles that they're dealing with. The ANC's is only more spectacular because they happen to be the majority party in the country by a long margin. These are people who, control 62% of the electorate, or get 62% of the electorate voting for them. And so they're really, if you look at South Africa's map, it's green. And so their record of achievement and spectacular failure is so much more public than anybody else's.
All right, Mohammed, getting into the topic for this evening, in simple terms, in layman's terms, what is a manifesto? You hear about it, we started hearing about it towards the end of last year, then you had the ANC launch theirs, the DA, the EFF. They talk about it in their campaigns, they seem to make reference to it, they'll knock each other's manifestos or elements of it. What is a manifesto?
Well, if you like spaceships, then choose between Star Trek and Star Wars. I think all of the manifestos are essentially giant spaceships that the parties have dreamt up in terms of promises and policies and these grand sort of visions of what they'll deliver to the people should they be given the mandate to govern. And the question that it always comes down to from analysts is, how are these promises going to be paid for? Are these promises practical, achievable, realizable, et cetera, et cetera? So, in general, for all the manifestos across the board, the ANC, the EFF, or the DA, they make promises or these visionary statements around education and healthcare and security and the economy, etc., which all cost money that ultimately has to come from the budget. But none of them really would outline the practicalities of how that would happen. So we get a broad sweep of, or a sense of feeling of, what the underpinnings of the party's ideologies are, and we know that already from their sort of origins and their historical sort of track records, and looking for new ideas or new solutions within those manifestos. My sense is that there isn't really anything very new in those manifestos. It's a rehashing of promises that have been made, in previous elections.
Is this a norm, like globally, that if you're standing for elections as a party, you got to come up with a manifesto? Perhaps elsewhere they may be using different terms. What do political parties try to achieve via a manifesto?
So in spaces where the contestation is a lot closer, so if you look at places like the United Kingdom or Italy or France, or you look to places where the margin of victory is not going to be as large as it traditionally has been in South Africa, what the opposition does is it proposes what it would do differently if it were to get into government to appeal to people. And generally people make decisions based on that. But whether they do so or not is a very different story. In spaces like the United Kingdom, people don't vote just for a party, they also vote for particular candidates. And so there's a closer control over what people are doing. They're voting for particular people because they can get things out of them. I agree with Mohammed that in some senses this is science fiction. So this is people projecting what they would do were they to get into government. But there's also an element of us being able as readers of these manifestos to see what each party prioritizes. So what do they put at the top of their agenda? What is, getting one line? What is getting 2 paragraphs? And how they echo one another when it comes to issues, because they're all trying to edge each other out of the way on the big issues that, as I mentioned before, really obsess and control the lives, the political lives of ordinary South Africans. Joblessness, economic stagnation, issues of crime, those kinds of questions. And it's interesting to listen to what is being said by each party and where in their list they put that, because in essence, South Africans are, being asked to look at each party and to go, well, you can either, pronounce talak 3 times and go through the process of separating yourself from the people you've been with now, or you can try and see whether you want one of these 2 in your relationship and incorporate it into your family. And I think many South Africans are really kind of not that interested in the written manifestos. They're listening to hear what the politicians are saying, because there's a history, as Mohammed has pointed out, of having things on paper that then when they get into power, actually something else is happening. For the two big parties, the official opposition, which has government in the Western Cape, it's not been an easy ride. Many of the promises that they've made, many people on the ground are saying you did not fulfill. The economic freedom fighters is in an enviable position in some senses because they've never been in government, so they can make all sorts of promises and they can't be judged on what they did when they were in government. What they're being judged on is what has their behavior been in public in relation to their professions.
Right. Time for our first break. When we come back, we continue the discussion with Mohammed Kaji, Angelo Fick, and Ibrahim Fakir will also be joining us after the break.
جميل المساعي وامنح الناس حبك جميل المساعي وامنح الناس حبك.
Welcome back. So we are talking about the manifestos of the ANC, the DA and the EFF, and our guests are all from ASRI, Mohammed Kaji, the Executive Director, Head of Research, Angelo Fick, and joining us now from this segment onwards, we have the Head of Programs, Ibrahim Fakir. Ibrahim, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran for having me.
Prior to the break, we were just talking about, the campaigns in general, and we spoke about, what is the meaning of a manifesto and what do political parties hope to achieve via these manifestos. But a question that came to my mind when I was perusing the 170-odd page EFF manifesto, and then I think it's 70-odd pages from the ANC, and the DA is also pretty long. Who reads this stuff? Apart from maybe academics and researchers who probably want to understand the nitty-gritties, why do they go into so much of detail? What's the point?
People like you who have to prepare for programs like this, other people who read the manifestos. Look, there's obviously some voters who do. Make no mistake, there are some people who would look for key aspects, which is why you'll find that many of them actually have summaries or infographics or pictographs and so forth, which is to basically provide the lie of the land and where they wish to go. That's what all parties would want to do. But the purpose of doing that is so that the electorate can actually hold them accountable, so can party members, and party members, at least in the case of the ANC, would be using what is in the manifesto to refine policy come the National General Council or the next set of National Executive Committee meetings. But whether voters actually read all of these manifestos overall, I think is fairly unlikely. I mean, the voters go on the basis of what is promised at big rallies, door-to-door campaigns, or other campaign events, where the headline issues outlined in the manifesto are actually propounded on. So it does serve a purpose. They're not completely useless. But make no mistake, there isn't a large number of voters who are reading all of these manifestos. Largely voters vote on the basis of, do we say ourselves identified in the party? Do they represent what I think I stand for? Is there compatibility between that? Some voters vote on the basis of a record. How they experience a government. And you found some evidence from 2011 of actually voters making a much more rational calculation for how they do so. So that's the third. The fourth is that you got an emergent band of voters who actually disregarding the manifestos and believing, do I like the party? Do I want to punish the party? And if I want to punish the party, how should I vote? So it's not necessarily all on the basis of the manifesto. But people like us, opposition parties, others, use the manifesto to hold others to account.
Picking up on that point, to what extent are political parties then held to account in terms of what's in the manifesto? So you can come out and say, we promised so many million jobs. 5 years later, apart from discussions like this, to what extent are these parties actually held to account for what they promised within those manifestos?
So for the parties of government, and I'm going to talk about the two, the ANC and the DA, there are, as Ibrahim pointed out, internal mechanisms. So the accounting process has much less to do, I think, often with holding people to account and saying to them, you didn't do what was necessary and we're now going to punish you, than it is to explaining away. So let's not forget that inside the ANC, all of those promises about economic growth, economic change, and how they were going to go about doing it, when it came to the 2014 elections, the explanation from government and from the ANC was there were forces larger outside the country, international market forces, that explain why things didn't happen the way in which they proposed they would happen. In the Democratic Alliance in the Western Cape, there was often a blaming of national government for, the fact that provincial government couldn't do the things that they... And you would hear it not just, in kind of formal policy statements, but you would hear it in the provincial legislature, you would hear it when premiers were being interviewed, that there are concerns around how that is managed. So there is a sense in which those documents are absolutely essential for citizens to have access to, because it is also what they can use at the next election, which may not be a general election, but may be a local government election, and say your party promised the following things in 2019, it is now 2021 or 2022, what have you done to implement this? Secondly, people are saying you promised last time you were here that this is what you would do, but this hasn't happened. So this is partly what is going on in Alexandra Township. So when people are being interviewed, they say, when this person was came here and he was elected mayor, they know that this is local government that happened in 2016. They know that coming up, they're not voting local government, they're voting national government and provincial government. But they're suggesting that this person's behavior in city government reflects on how much trust they can place in the party. And what one hears when people are being interviewed is they're saying, we didn't trust the people who were there before. We placed our trust in you people in city government. Why should we trust these people to now do what the other people that they replaced in city government didn't do in national government or provincial government? So there are ways in which citizens are using these issues very strategically for their own self-understanding of the way the world works, and it's not a kind of confusion of local and national issues. They're very clear in how they separate those and how they link them across elections.
Moment, before we look at the specific issues within the manifestos and the manifesto of each of these three parties, when you look at those three manifestos, what do you pick up in terms of similarities, differences, the style and the approach to the manifesto?
I think what stood out for me clearly, and I'm sure Ibrahim and Angelo would have views as well, is the EFF's manifesto had a very strong sort of statist sort of big government, like government would do everything and make all of these laws or pass all of this policy to achieve their objective. So it came out as a very sort of centralized, central planning, statist kind of approach. One of the things that really stood out for me with theirs is that they wanted to implement compulsory critical thinking lessons for everyone in high school, for example, and those are like very sort of statist sort of views. For me, the ANC manifesto has some sort of trajectory and continuity from previous manifestos in terms of, the language as well as the ideology that's underpinning it, which is largely trying to be very sort of social democrat, that we're going to be, that discussion around mixed economy and jobs being created, and the continuity from the State of the Union address when there's all of these referrals to the presidential summits and the other summits. So, for me, for those two particularly, the ANC and the EF manifestos, those were sort of the clear sort of trends that I picked up from them.
All right, I want to take a look at the ANC's manifesto for a while, just some of the key aspects. Ibrahim, they start off, let's grow South Africa together. And as expected, being the ruling party, they talk about, they seem to be very candid up front. We accept the mistakes that we have made in critical areas, progress has stalled. And then they talk about their own track record. But there's one thing in specific that I want you to comment on. And I quote from here, they say, few countries in the world have succeeded in expanding vital services such as water, sanitation, electricity, roads, and housing to so many people in such a short time. So they're saying, in other words, don't talk about how many people still don't have houses and electricity. Nobody has done what we could do in such a short space of time. Accurate or not?
On paper, yes. And they're absolutely right. Of the different parties, and I mean, I hold no brief for the ANC, but it is the most prudent and probably the most astute of the different manifestos. So it's quite clear and quite categorical in the sense of where the country was in 1994 and where the country is now. So they've got data on the number of water connections, the number of electrification. Do you know that in 1994, only 36% of the country was actually connected to the electricity grid? You now have close to 80%. So there's massive inroads. You talk about basic education, basic coverage of health. So all of that is absolutely true. The ANC has been terribly successful at building the largest welfare state. Where they refuse to take responsibility is in the following. You can only build a state and a society on welfarist principles up to a certain point. Beyond that, the stage of historical development has to shift towards building the economy, growing it, sharing the pie, even if you're going to have a redistributive impetus. And this is where they refuse to take responsibility, firstly. Secondly, they refuse to take responsibility for 9 years of completely wasteful expenditure. So, taking responsibility for Nkandla, revisiting all of the constitutional court judgments which have been passed both against the Speaker of Parliament, against the former President, but also critically the Social Development Minister. So there are a large number of social grant recipients who are caught in the web of a corrupt contract with the cash paymaster services. And this doesn't look on the surface of it as if it should affect everyone. But if you're in that category of person, it does, because your big corporates like ShopRite and other mashonisas, that means the people who extend small-time credit, actually have a right on that contract to skim off the top of what they owe you. And that really has a massive impact. So the ANC refuses to take responsibility for those kind of things. And they're massive, because what they mean is that the level of trust and confidence of the people who actually grow the economy is not with you. And the 2016 local government election is a signal lesson for them. They haven't learned, if you read this manifesto, they haven't learned the lessons of 2016, which is that you are punished for impunity, and you are punished for the way in which you refuse to take responsibility and the arrogance with which you treat citizens. That's what they refuse to take responsibility for. So the manifesto on paper is the most prudent. In behavior and in action, it is completely contradictory to what they say. South African citizens are not looking for a state which functions purely as a machine with inputs, outputs, measurable deliverables. That's what the ANC can show successfully on certain areas. Not on the economy, not on building a culture of accountability, and not on building a culture of responsiveness. And they haven't learned this lesson, because where Angelo and I slightly differ is that though we agree on what the motivating factors in Alexandra is, the problem in Alexandra is that it's actually driven by the ANC as a campaign issue. It is to destabilize the province to an extent, or at least the area, to an extent that it doesn't allow opposition parties to either campaign there, or it's also a punishing mechanism.
Angela, your thoughts on the ANC's manifesto? What stood out for you as positive? Where were you disappointed?
Partly, I think that it is the good story to tell that the ANC has. So there are these gestures of admitting to mistakes. But I agree with Ibrahim that the lessons haven't been taken to heart, with new suggestions for how those lessons will result in changes in the future. And the behavior that we've seen inside ANC deployees, both in the party at the senior level and in government, suggests that there are groups of people pulling in one direction who want to see change, and there are groups of people who actually are resisting those people and are using this particular moment in public to fight out what are internal issues in the ANC. And then beyond that, I think what is of real concern is that the ANC inherited what was constructed to be a majority rural, excluded from the city's country in 1994 because of a history of colonial and apartheid legislation excluding the majority of blacks from being urbanized in apartheid and colonial South Africa. In 25 years, we have become a majority urban country. And for the last 20 years, researchers, scholars have all pointed to the fact that the ANC's economic policy initiatives are too tied in with neoliberal ideas and are not taking account of the millions of people who are gathering at the edges of our cities, people who, by one premier, not in the ANC, were referred to as refugees, people who, are gathering at the edges of the cities to pick up the crumbs of urban wealth, because the rural areas are not moments of sort of collapse, but if you don't sustain rural production, urban spaces require them in order to get food, to get water, to get all sorts of things that they wouldn't have if those rural areas don't exist. And so this kind of corruption issue has also had the consequence of having urban concentrations of perpetually poor. The last OECD study said that if South Africa maintains its current economic trajectory, it will take 9 generations for the poorest of this country to reach equality with the average person, not the wealthiest, the average person in this country. So we're not even talking about somebody who's particularly wealthy. And that kind of lack of development is what has fueled the service delivery protests, the unhappinesses with joblessness, the kinds of problems that we have seen. That government's response to has always been consistently providing either cherry-picked solutions, not necessarily what is needed, no integrated planning, and in some cases, kind of really repressive responses from the state. The people of Vuwani can tell the story. The people of Bekkersdal can tell the story. The people of Lwandle can tell the story in the Western Cape. That these are people who gather on the edges of cities and are really treated very appallingly, not just by government, but by the state as a whole, private as well as public sector.
The advantage the ANC has with this manifesto is that, crafted as it is, it appeals to the group that Angelo is talking about, the people who would still want to look to the ANC as the benefactor in state, who will distribute all these good things to them and improve their lives somewhat. But that's not the real catchment that the ANC actually needs for this election, because who have they lost influence over? They've lost influence over the large metropolitan areas. Ekurhuleni, Tshwane, Johannesburg, Cape Town. 4 major metros which are the drivers of growth. Now the lessons from 1979 Britain, when the Labour Party then had lost control or influence, at least of the north, the coal mining, manufacturing, industrial hubs of the north, as well as metropolitan London. When they lost influence over those groups, they lost power to a Thatcherite right wing, the inception of the neoliberal age, so to speak. And the ANC is facing that danger now because they've lost influence over that group of people, but they've also lost influence over the group of people that Angelo is talking about, because those are the people who didn't turn out to vote for them in 2016. So the only advantage they got is Ramaphosa, for who some of these people have blind faith in, misplaced and misguided, I would think. And they're trying to appeal to the group that Angelo is talking about through this manifesto. There's aspects of this manifesto which talks about local manufacturing, local industrialization, set-asides and incentives for those groups. But you don't have the uptake in civil society, and you don't have the infrastructure to support that kind of local industrialization yet.
All right, time for the next break. When we come back, we continue the discussion on the manifestos of the ANC, the DA, and the EFF. Welcome back. So we're talking manifestos of the 3 bigger parties, major parties, whatever you want to call them, the ANC, the DA, and the EFF. We have Mohamed Kaji, Angelo Fick, and Ibrahim Fakir from ASRI. It is elections time. They're very busy, and they've been kind enough to give us of their valuable time. Now, Mohamed, before the break, we spoke about the ANC's manifesto. The DA's manifesto, they're talking about an agenda for change, one South Africa for all. They find themselves in an interesting space. The ANC obviously talks about its own track record in each one of the major categories. The DA will criticize the ANC as an opposition party and then talk about where we govern. That's the caption they were using in terms of their own track record in Western Cape and then in the metros, Tshwane and Joburg and Nelson Mandela Bay. What did you make of the DA's manifesto?
Look, the DA largely has benefited, and as our discussion from the previous segment, where the ANC has been losing essentially the middle class, the black middle class vote, either through abstentions of those voters not coming out to turn out at the polls or voting for other parties, and in particular minority areas, really the DA, and the black middle class as well voting for the DA in sort of smatterings. I think that's really their sort of constituency that they appealing to or trying to retain and then trying to grow on that in this election. So, their manifesto is largely trying to keep to their sort of liberal roots, but also that sort of reaching out to social democracy and trying to compete on some issues that the other parties are obviously campaigning big on, like land, for example. So let me use that example. The DA on land speaks about expropriation, but then that it has to be handed out privately to individuals rather than being owned by the state and so on. So they, there's sort of this realization on some of the issues that they can't compete on it on a total sort of, outright rejection of those issues, because the traditional DA view on that would have been, no expropriation without compensation, no expropriation and so on. And there's sort of like a movement or moderation there to say, well, land has to be redistributed, but it has to be redistributed privately in private ownership. So in that sense, I think, as you said, the DA is trying to, play up their own achievements where they have been governing, and then try to challenge some of the parties on some of the issues for the election. And, I think that challenge between their liberalism and the sort of social democracy elements in terms of their policies sort of comes out within the manifesto as well, in trying to balance those two.
And so the DA is the official opposition party, right? When you read through their manifesto, do you get a sense that they have a better plan to address the key problems in South Africa if they were to take over from the ANC? Just looking at it on paper.
So there's been a shift in the DA's manifesto that I read. So they used to say it's not the ANC's policies that are a problem, it's the implementation phase that is a problem. And if we got into power, we would implement it better. They've actually moved beyond that and suggested very different policies from the ANC's in some regards. So they are promulgating this thing called liberal democracy, which of course is a very interesting concept to do in the most unequal society in the world. So they're both, I've been hearing since 1985 that the ANC is a broad church. I think for the first time I'm going to start hearing that the DA is a broad church, because there are multiplicities of sometimes not commensurable policies inside the DA's manifesto. So there are ideas around, economic redress, but then there are concepts that they want to do away with. So they want to empower masses of people through private initiatives. And the research, and I've just recently read Mike Davis's Planet of Slums, in which he talks about how the history of handing over land as title deed to poor people to enrich them actually failed spectacularly, because what happens is that those people then sell the land on, and the poorest of people don't benefit from it. It's that class of petty bourgeois just above them that launch themselves into the middle classes, and the poor sink even further lower. The examples that he uses are India, Brazil, land reform issues that were instituted in some African polities. This idea that if you simply give people title deed and some control over it, they can leverage it in the economy to get loans through micro-lending institutions, that recipe is really a kind of recipe that hasn't worked and is part of structural adjustment programs across the 80s and 90s. Those SAPs have failed spectacularly. So it's interesting to hear them being re-voiced differently inside the DA manifesto. And alongside that, there are what I think of as the social democratic impulse inside the DA, which is the only way they know they can appeal to millions of voters to catapult them out of the 20s into the 30s and possibly into the 40% of the electorate. Because the majority of people in this country are poor. The majority of people in this country are young. The majority of people in this country increasingly do not have a visceral experience of official legislated apartheid. Their visceral experience is of the consequences of colonialism and apartheid, not of apartheid itself. And in this country, we often conflate those two things, and they're very different. And so the DA's election manifesto for me is different from the one I saw in 2014, where it was clearly still a kind of specific liberal program that had to do with the policies aren't bad, the implementation is bad. This time I'm hearing we have slightly different policies from the ANC, particularly on issues of land and of job growth.
The DA's manifesto, your thoughts, Ibrahim?
The thing that struck me about the DA's manifesto is the slogan of one job, one household, one job, which is a little bit like the ANC's, but it's a bit of a pipe dream, because I don't know how you're going to get that. The second is that I differ slightly with my colleagues in the sense that I think there's been a shift in the DA from the kind of pure supply side economic interventions which are necessary, which they thought necessary, to much more demand side stuff. So they prepared to even think about social grants, something the DA never used to talk about. In fact, they wanted to do away with social grants or reduce them. They're actually talking in their manifesto about increasing them, or at least increasing the rebate that you would get on a social grant. So interestingly, I think they've made the shift. They also, I get the sense, have moved away from this liberal core, which is why you've had splinters out of them like the ZACP, the South African Capitalist Party with the purple cow. And those people appear to be sort of die-hard, dyed-in-the-wool libertarians. But they're actually just quite abrasive and arrogant. Some of them, of course, have cause to be, but be that as it may, it doesn't land well. But I think because of that shift, these people started these alternative splinters. So the DA manifesto is obviously different on the basis of land, because they buy into the consensus that we had post-1994, which is the classic land restitution, land redistribution, on the basis of policy which was crafted 1994 to 1998. And they believed that that would work. The unfortunate thing is that Angelo's right about the neoliberal color of it. The ANC is kind of buying into some of that stuff, because unfortunately one of Ramaphosa's advisors happens to be a guy called Ricardo Hausmann, who's a classic right-wing libertarian in his approach to the way in which he thinks about the economy. Now that might be tempered by a whole lot of things, but both the DA, what the DA's manifesto shares with the ANC is actually a lot more than is different, actually. I get the sense that they're saying we would actually be a better ANC than the ANC. That's the sense I get from their manifesto.
Mohammed, EFF, land and jobs, they make it very clear right in the beginning of the manifesto. That is what it's about. They do a diagnosis about the conditions in South Africa today, and then they have a very long plan, 170 pages, almost 100 pages more than the DA and the ANC. Is there that much extra substance in those 100 pages, or is it more, more rhetoric?
If you got through all 170 pages, I think you can tell us what's on page 150. So I'll tell you what came across for me to the EFF, is the EFF knows who their constituency is. They have a large youth constituency that they're appealing to, and if you look at what's in the priorities, in the first few pages that most of us would go through is, they appeal to that sort of young constituency that they're appealing to. So that's really who they know that they're appealing to, and jobs is really the issue that you're looking at. Our youth unemployment levels in South Africa is sitting at around 40%, and that's who they're appealing to. So if you look at some of the policies that they're suggesting or promising in their manifesto, they're saying things like a job for every single graduate. Every single graduate who comes out of a postgraduate or post-secondary education would be promised a job when they come out of university. The free education comes out strongly in their manifesto, where they're promising free education across the board for higher education. And I think that potentially was a lost opportunity for the other parties in terms of who they were appealing to. And I think that jobs has always been an issue in South Africa, but land equally so, and that has been really an issue that the EFF put on the agenda and maintained from the beginning and from their launch, and to the extent where they've managed to get it to Parliament from a point where they're only a 40-seat party at this point. And I think they're going to benefit from that in almost doubling their support in this election.
Angelo, when you read the manifesto of the EFF, do you get a sense that they are in a position of advantage from this perspective, that they're not running national government, nor are they running any provincial governments or even any of the metros, and they're not likely to do this after the next election. Therefore, they can make big promises, and they won't be, that if we come into power, this is what we'll do and that is what we'll do, which may be appealing, but they're not likely to be held to account because they're never going to be in power in the foreseeable future.
There is that element where they can make the promises because they have nothing in government that they can be judged on as, well, you say you'll do this, but there's a record of you not having done it. But the 170 pages for me are not necessarily just laughable. I mean, I think they go into details, which is the way in which they then attack the other parties. So they mention Kolobeni. They're actually, getting in there and suggesting that this very local issue is an example of how, if they had power, they would deal with it differently. They talk about, the numbers of kilometers that people still have to walk to school in this country. So they're choosing the kind of left behinds, left outs, and the excludeds as their, target audience. And they are very clear that they're not interested in continuing the gains that those of us who sit in the middle classes have had in post-apartheid South Africa. They have a very different vision. Now, whether one agrees with that vision, or whether one finds that vision scary, or whether one thinks that they'll never be able to implement it, they've actually gone a slightly different route. So while the two bigger parties have gone the bird's eye view of taking a large overview of the landscape, what the EFF has done is gone in and on the ground found out what are the issues and used that. Because the ANC did exactly the same thing. They went down to the ground, talked to people, consulted, got from their branches and various community engagements, but chose not to speak their manifesto at the level of ordinary people's experience in that level of detail. But these 170 pages tell you the stories of ordinary community struggles and elevate them into this is what should be national issues by using ordinary examples that people hear in the news or experience on everyday level. And so there, I think, the EFF's approach to the manifesto writing process is possibly born out of the ANC's, but unlike the ANC's, it isn't then going up to the bird's eye view. It remains on that ground level and would look like a lot of unconnected detail for somebody, but actually is how they've decided to knit the way in which they appeal.
Just before we go for a break, Ibrahim, your thoughts on the EFS manifesto. Is it the most appealing to the younger voters from the three?
I don't necessarily think so, simply because they're so wholly unrealistic that the technicians would say this familiar phrase, fiscal cliff. The thing about the EFS manifesto is that it will take you over the fiscal cliff, into the fiscal abyss.
On a spaceship?
Literally. Well, probably not even in a spaceship, but on a free fall. Because look at what they're promising. 24-hour clinics. So where are the resources for 24-hour clinics going to come from? Where the current complement of clinics can't be run effectively with the doctors and nurses that you've got. So look, it all sounds fantastic, and it really is. I mean, I agree with Angelo. It's not completely irrational. There's a rationality behind it. It's just an unrealistic rationality. But guess what? They're not the only ones who do this. The DA is equally guilty of pushing things over the fiscal abyss because they don't want, and no one wants to talk about this. A policeman on every street. That's in the DA's manifesto. So quite how they're going to do this and have the people to supervise it, because they themselves say in the manifesto that state capacity is low. Now, if state capacity is low, how are you going to do any of these things if you weren't able to do so while you've been in local government, running municipalities, instead of running national government? So look, the EFF's manifesto would be appealing for a specific group of people. Even people like me who come from a tradition where we believe in a large state, and welfare state with massive interventions and big parcels of redistributionary goodies that come across to everyone to protect the vulnerable, but also to elevate some people. It's all fantastic. The problem is, if the evidence of the last 25 years are telling you that massive state control over a whole range of things have actually given rise not just to corruption, but massive inefficiencies, then you have to rethink this approach.
All right, we take our final break. When we come back, we're going to be wrapping up the discussion on the manifestos with our three guests this evening. Welcome back. So as part of our election coverage, we've been looking at the manifestos of the ANC, the DA and the EFF this evening with Mohamed Kaji, Angelo Fake and Ibrahim Fakir from ASRI. We have just a few minutes left. So gentlemen, what I'm going to ask you to do is each one of you, just tell me your thoughts on the key issues. Economy, land, corruption, the SOEs, those kind of stuff. What are the similarities? What are the differences? Anything that stood out for you between the three manifestos, Mo?
On social grants, there's commonalities across all of them because they're all promising social grants and increases in social grants. I think the common theme, and I don't want to take time because I know we don't have a lot of it, but the common theme for me in this election is that there's essentially a focus across all three on jobs, and there's a realization that the economy is central. But for the ANC, for me, if the manifesto starting in 94 and outlining all of these achievements since 94, if they had to start that point in the last 10 years, the numbers would look dramatically different. And let's not forget that Jacob Zuma promised 6 million jobs when he was president. So a lot of those promises come off as, fantasy rather than reality, because there has been 25 years of opportunity to deliver on them.
Angelo, your thoughts?
So for me, it's the combination of economic growth and change and transformation with jobs, but also that means having to rethink education. And I think all three of the big parties, including the ANC in government, does not have enough or an adequate response to how they're going to change that education component, which will lead to the transformation of the economy, because this is also about skills. We've just heard that banks are going to be shedding jobs in the thousands because the technological shifts have allowed them to do so. This is going to happen across a whole range of other industries. People are using this catchphrase, fourth industrial revolution, but it really, at the heart of it, has to do with skills, capacity, education failures, and all three of the big parties make big promises but don't adequately address that key component of how they wish to transform economy and society.
Right?
Look, the ANC is in part harking back to its 1994 manifesto. It's a kind of back to basics approach, in large part in building on it. That's what I think Ramaphosa is doing. So the EFF and the DA are doing pretty much the same, except that they couched in much more radical language, and I think it's a radical departure for both of them. I think it's a radical departure for the DA from what it was. Remember, the group who thought we want to be an alternative to the ANC lost out to those who believe that the DA is an alternative ANC. The EFF always was going to have a groundswell radical approach to it. So that's what's common for all of them. It is pretty radical in terms of what they're suggesting. That where the DA and the ANC differ is on the question of SOEs, and that's a question you've asked. So on SOEs, what is common is that both Ramaphosa's intention is to restructure some of them, but retain some of them within full state control, with full state shareholding. The DA's departure is slightly different. So they also talk about restructuring and rationalization, but they want to talk about rationalization in terms of combining some and selling some off completely. This harks back to the old supply side type intervention. So they want to sell off some of them completely with private stakes, particularly when it comes to SAA and so forth. But on the economy, on the creation of jobs, they have some fairly similar approaches to how they think this needs to happen: promoting competition, industrialization, breaking monopolies, incepting competition. And it's interesting for me that the Competition Commission has been doing a lot more work over the last 2 years, and especially since Ramaphosa has been in power. The Competition Commission has done serious work around anti-competitive behavior. So I think that bodes well for the ANC, but I don't think that they're going to look at a very big majority, to be perfectly honest.
Gentlemen, obviously these manifestos are long, and we could have had a very lengthy discussion around them, but in the time that we've had, I think you've given us good insight and good perspective, and we thank you really for your time this evening. Much appreciated. Assalamu alaikum. To the viewers, until next week, inshallah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa